Okay, I think we can probably call the roll, and then I'll acknowledge the rest of the ex-cappers who come in, so we can at least start public comment.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, I'll take roll. Gregory Braille.
I'm here.
Phil Burton.
Here.
Tony Carrasco.
Not here yet.
In-Yang Cho.
Not here yet.
Larry Klein.
Here.
Nadia Nayak.
Here.
Keith Reckdahl.
Not yet.
Dave Shen.
Here.
Carrie Templeton.
Here.
Well, actually, I see Keith just joined us. Keith, you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, perfect.
No video, but audio.
We'll take it how we can get it.
Probably preferable.
Okay, awesome. So the next item on the agenda is again oral communications. And I just want to remind everybody, this is for items that are not currently on the agenda. It looks like 2 hands up. Is there anybody else who wanted to speak on this item? 3. Anybody else? Okay, I think we can do 2 minutes each. And so I'll let you guys take it away. And I just want to, before we start, I just want to acknowledge we have lots of new staff members who are helping us today to do all the behind the scenes work and make it look like a fabulous show. So I want to say thanks to the entire Office of Transportation who's helping us here. So go for it.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Our first speaker for today during oral communications is Catherine Jordan. Catherine, you have 2 minutes. Please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'd like to reiterate opposition to any recommendation to close Churchill Avenue and bring up the question of grade separations. According to the XCAP memo from the chair about the draft outline of the XCAP report, the first item of the draft outline is why do we need grade separations? It's referenced that the reason for that is the increased number of trains and references Caltrain's business plan, talking about 6 trains increasing service. That business plan, Caltrain's business plan, according to Caltrain on its webpage, is paused. And Caltrain itself is focused on recovery planning due to COVID-19, meaning that that business plan is no longer operative, as it should not be, considering that Caltrain's ridership is down 97% currently. So that business plan being paused, of course, brings up the need for grade separations. It also brings up the previously very optimistic service increases that were projected based on the very optimistic tripling of ridership projections that were projected that are no longer valid. As Caltrain says, since its business plan is paused and since considering it has lost 97% of its ridership. You would say, oh, that's just due to COVID. Well, pre-COVID, Caltrain ridership has been flat since 2016 and lost riders in 2019. Pre-COVID, the Bay Area population was COVID. So discussions about traffic congestion, long commutes, etc., are no longer aligned with reality. So when we talk about the need for grade separations, we have to consider those things. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Terry Lack. Please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now.
Hey guys, can you hear me all? Oh, good. Thanks again for letting us talk and for being so dedicated and having all these meetings, hours and hours you spend on Zoom now, right? So I wanted to say, I actually, you know, the last speaker's comments were very interesting, and I understand what she's trying to say. But fundamentally, if we're going to make a decision on Churchill and the decisions that are on the table, which includes the partial underpass, the viaduct, or closing Churchill, the only one that makes sense is closing Churchill. And the facts support it. The fact of the fire and police say it's fine. the fact that the traffic report from Hexagon says is fine, the fact that it's going to cost multiple millions less, multiple years less of building, it is the only solution if you're going to do something. If you're going to do something, you have to close Churchill because the facts support closing Churchill. And there's absolutely no reason to spend multiple millions of dollars on something we don't need. And I do appreciate that that means that some people, including myself, will have to drive a little longer. But the fact that you're going to take people's property and take their land to do some of these things like the partial underpass is a non-starter for me. If that were my land, I'd want someone to fight for me, and I'm going to fight for them. It's just not right to take people's lands and spend hundreds of millions of dollars when it's not necessary. And the traffic report clearly says it's not necessary. The fire and police clearly say it's not necessary. And the handful of people who have to drive more, including myself, we will get used to it. So please, if you have to do something, close Churchill. Don't do the partial underpass. Don't do an ugly viaduct. I am begging you, don't destroy our neighborhood. Thank you.
Our next speaker is David Kennedy. Please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now. David Kennedy, please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now.
Thank you. I was trying to find the right button to push. With due respect to the previous speaker, I'd like to point out again that the city's comprehensive plan says that the cross connections between the community should be enhanced, maintained and enhanced, and closing Churchill would not do that. A couple of other quick comments I'd like to make. I would ask that the XCAP spend a bit more time looking at the ped bike interface. I've gotten to the point in my life where I really shouldn't be riding a bicycle anymore. So when I go someplace that's fairly close, I either have to be in a vehicle or walk. And I have to say, when I get back from walking through an underpass where bikes are, I sort of do a short prayer of thanks because it's really quite dangerous. The other comment I'd like to make at this point is I think at the last meeting, which I unfortunately was not able to attend, there were some comments, some questions about whether XCAP should proceed with the recommendations or not. I urge you to come up with recommendations for these crossings. They should have been done years and years ago, grade separations. I've seen too many accidents and they continue. And it's just something the city should get done. If they don't do them immediately, at least they'll have something, a plan that can go forward when funding becomes available. Thanks for the chance to comment a little bit here.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lisa Nissim. Please unmute yourself and you can talk now.
Hi, I live in in Southgate, and I just wanted to support conductivity and connectiveness. We live in Southgate because we want to be part of Palo Alto. We don't want to be cut off from Palo Alto. The railroad tracks already serve as a way of cutting us off. Let's not make it worse. I certainly sympathize with the committee who must make a decision between using the views of a few who live on Churchill who want to be cut off from the rest of the city versus those of us who live in Southgate, Old Palo Alto, Professorville, who want to stay connected with the city. So I want us to urge you to please do anything but close Churchill. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Susan Neuman. Please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now.
Hi there. I don't want to get into a tit for tat with other members of the community, but I just want to clarify the point about whether the traffic analysis that's been done indeed shows that it will be fine if Churchill is closed. I have a specific memory that closing Churchill will result in level F and worse at Oregon and El Camino. And many of us who are trying to head south on Alma now will need to take that route when we're coming out of Southgate. So that comment keeps getting made, and I just want to be sure that everybody remembers that it is really not okay. That's not even mentioning the many issues with the study that were discussed. So I don't think many of us feel comfortable accepting the projections, even on the other intersections that were studied. And I just want to second Lisa's comment about how many of us in Churchill, I would say most of us in Southgate rather, feel about the prospect of being separated from the rest of Palo Alto and having only one route out of our neighborhood. It would put a neighborhood of our size in a completely unique position in the city, I believe. And I think it would be, it would really hurt residents in Southgate and harm the neighborhood. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Inder Monga. Please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now.
Hi, how are you? I wanted to talk about the crossing as well. And while you've heard from Catherine about the ridership and the trains that is happening with Caltrain, the high school and the traffic north and south of Palo Alto is not going to go less, because that is there for the long term. The kids are going to be on bikes when the school opens up and this resolves itself. And closing Churchill is going to spill traffic to other intersections and cause issues there. So I think it's not a matter of destroying any neighborhood. It's about making things flow easy from north to south and making sure Palo Alto as a town does well. So my what I entreat you guys is not to close Churchill and to look at some of the creative options that the community has placed in front of you, the partial underpass and the grade separation, any other ideas, and recommend further study if there are issues like one of the previous persons mentioned about land or something. I think these are solvable problems, but the intersection should not be closed. So thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Eduardo Lack. Please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now.
Eduardo, we're having some trouble hearing you.
We cannot hear you, Eduardo.
Oh, Eduardo?
Oh, okay.
Eduardo?
I apologize, I'm on a cell. Yes, I'm trying to speak, but it doesn't seem to be working.
Okay, now we can hear you.
Apologize.
We can hear you now. Would you like to speak?
Yes. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
I apologize. I'm on a cell phone. My computer wasn't working correctly. Yeah, I think that I want to thank you again for all the work that you've done. I think that the data that we have on the mitigation on Oregon and Embarcadero with the closure of Churchill continue to point to better traffic throughout the city. I think that Palo Alto has 6 or 7 crossings, east and west, and all the cities north and south of us have significantly less. So per mile, we have way more. So I think that from a community perspective, it's pretty clear that Menlo Park and all the other cities are managing fine with far less crossings east and west. And because of that, I want to urge that we focus on what makes sense for the whole city, north, south, east, and west. And the mitigation studies that you've done and the traffic analysis that you've done tend to point to a success of fixing Embarcadero, Oregon, and closing Churchill. That would also increase the safety of the children and everybody in the neighborhood. So please hopefully that will be the recommendation that you make. And again, thank you for everything. You've also indicated that noise will be a huge improvement. Not having the trains honking on Churchill will reduce decibels by 20 decibels, which is a significant reduction in noise to everybody, Southgate and Churchill included. Thank you again for all the great work that you're doing.
Our next speaker is Adrian Branch. Please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now. Adrian Branch, please unmute yourself and it's your turn to talk now. Adrian? I think we're having connection issues, so I'll move on to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Rob Levitsky. Please.
Can you hear me now?
Oh. Yeah, we can hear you now.
I'm sorry, there was something else going on here. Apologies. I wanted to comment briefly on some of the ridership comments. I'm the vice chair of the Citizens Advisory Committee for Caltrain, and so I do keep pretty well abreast of what's going on with the train. Caltrain last week reported ridership has doubled from its lowest point, so it is beginning to come back. But if you double a small number, it's still a small number. So admittedly, the ridership is nowhere near where it was or should be, but that's just a point of information for the community. The other observation I would have just in following this whole process is at least, and this is just an issue that, or a value that I share for all communities looking at grade steps, is not preserving community connectivity and at-grade connections that are very bike and community and pedestrian friendly. And to that end, as long as cost were no object, I see the viaduct as the most attractive approach for Churchill, simply because it does not involve any property takings. That's a major issue that is off the table with the viaduct. Secondly, it's only 20 feet high in the worst possible configuration at the crossing itself, tapering down to less than 20 feet on either side. And just for comparison, most single-family homes, the peak of the roof is nearly 20 feet, and certainly on two-story homes, it's even higher. With landscaping, trees, heavily planted neighborhoods such as there are on both sides of the right-of-way in Palo Alto, that's the visual impact is quite limited. Obviously, if you're immediately behind or adjacent to, it's greater than for others. But all things considered, it has no impact on creating barriers to cross, connecting to the two sides of the community, and there's activated space underneath that can be activated. And so I just wanted to point those things out. And there's no substantial sound difference either in terms of the noise, which was another concern raised. So that was it. Thanks.
Our final speaker is Rob Levitsky. Please unmute yourself and you can begin to talk now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, this is Rob Levitsky. I haven't been to one of these Zoom meetings before. They're not very effective as far as public comment, I don't think, but I'm here anyway. Embarcadero and Oregon are not broken, and it's really unfortunate that so many people from Churchill, or people who want to close Churchill, are blaming Embarcadero or seeming to think that Gary Black has some magic bullet to fix things. Gary Black's own study said that 2/3 of the cars that would be normally crossing across Churchill, the 9,500 a day, would probably come to Embarcadero, and maybe a third would go to Oregon, just because Embarcadero is 3 blocks away and Oregon is 9 blocks away. It's not fair to dump the cars from closing Churchill onto Embarcadero or Oregon. To make life nice and sweet for almost a cul-de-sac on Churchill, while we dump all the cars onto Embarcadero in Oregon and stick in a signal at High Street. It's ridiculous to think that you're going to speed up traffic on Embarcadero by adding yet another signal, a 4th one, within about a quarter mile between Embarcadero, Town and Country, the crosswalk, and then this new thing at High Street. Another thing somebody just said is that Menlo Park does with just a few less crossings. Well, Menlo Park is half the size of Palo Alto, and Menlo Park doesn't have as many commuters coming in every day. Anyway, I agree with the other folks who said Churchill should stay open, or at least not be closed. Perhaps one of these other options of a viaduct or the partial underpass would be better. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our public speakers for agenda item number 2.
Great, thank you so much. And I just want to double check, do we have any other XCAP members that I've missed? No, I don't see anybody else yet who's joined. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the XCAP report outline. So at our last meeting, we seemed to decide to keep going and try to get to this final report. So since we've lost a couple of members, I tried my best to sort of reassign sections to everybody. And I did want to announce, for the community's sake, that XCAP received the email today that unfortunately Adina Levin is also going to be leaving XCAP. Adina, as you may know, is the person who heads up Friends of Caltrain, but she also works on Seamless Bay Area and many other transportation nonprofits. And she is fighting the good fight to try to keep transit funding and do all sorts of big things. And so at this time, she feels like she could have attended some meetings, but not all. And since we're going to go into deliberations, she didn't think it would be an effective way for her to participate and potentially make it difficult for us to make some decisions. So in my memo to XCAP members, I do have Adina's name in there helping you out, Phil. So we'll need to figure out whether you're still okay with what's left. And then Carrie, I moved you to a different section to see if you might be able to work with Dave and Inyoung. I wanted to hear from you if that's okay. And Keith and Phil, I also wanted to see if you guys might be able to take Megan's draft and work on things. And then Greg, I wanted to check in with you about the 2 sections that I put your name on. So I guess happy to let you guys raise your hands and see who wants to go first. But definitely wanted to hear back from you. Make sure do these sections sound okay? Is it a no? Is it a yes? Do you want to do a different section? Obviously, this is by no means an official assignment. I'm looking for everyone's honest participation and ability to participate. So let me know where you stand. Carrie, I see your hand up first, so go for it.
Hi, I think that the work I'm doing on the matrix fits naturally into the section you chose for me. So, you know, working on how the material is communicated. So I'm comfortable with that. I'm happy to do that.
Great, thank you. And I did want to say that Carrie's been working on a matrix. We'll talk about it a little bit more in agenda item number 5 when we do XCAP member updates. But we're hoping to have something that we could look at maybe next week. So big thanks to Carrie for looking at that. Okay, anybody? Keith, I see your hand up next, and then I see Greg.
Yeah, certainly I can do whatever needs to be done. Let's talk offline to see what she's done and what's remaining, and if that's the best spot for Phil and me. But short answer is yes.
Great, perfect. And Tony too, although he's not on the call, so I'll have to call him and make sure that he's okay with this. Greg, how about you? Oh, Greg, we can't hear you.
I lowered my hand, but I didn't unmute. So, yeah, we have the draft from Pat. My only concern is that it's very long. So we should maybe talk offline about what are the key points to get across in that section, because right now it's extremely long. I would love to see safety included. Maybe I brought this up before, and maybe you could just tell me, no, Greg, we decided not to do this. I would like to see a section in safety in section 1 on why do we need grade separation. And the reason is that our safety statistics for Caltrain in general, but especially in Palo Alto, are pretty bad. And I think reminding the community of that fact, I'm happy to draft something up.
Okay, great.
If you're willing to have such a section.
Yeah, I mean, I unless anybody has an objection to that, I'd be fine adding a 1.5 that talks about safety, and it could be sort of an introduction to the safety elements.
And I can move some of Pat's stuff into there as well.
Yeah, Greg, since I'm responsible, I'm probably now the only person really responsible. I'd be happy to work with you on that.
Okay, great. So then when
No
we figure
problem.
out when we're going to do this, okay,
We'll
awesome.
just work offline and we'll get it done.
Yeah,
No
great.
problem.
And then
talking about, let's say, 2 paragraphs or something like that, maybe a table.
I don't want to go on a big impassioned plea. Just 2 paragraphs and a couple numbers is all that I want to have in there.
That's no problem at all.
And then in section 6.2, I'm not sure exactly what to do. If there's someone in staff I can coordinate with to kind of help consolidate the things that we received, I'm happy to write a summary based on, here's links to 10 reports we received from the various entities over the years. Please summarize this.
Yeah, so I think for that one, I mean, we definitely have a letter from PAUSD.
Yeah.
And we have to check in with staff and see if we're getting another one. And then I think we can talk offline, but we've had lots of input from the Bicycle Coalition. So I wanted to make sure to include those guys in there. And then we can work with staff and we can chat about it. But as long as you're okay working on that section, we can just be gathering things more than writing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we had the bicycle. We had at some point, I know we had some from the police department and maybe even from fire, I think, on emergency vehicle access. So yeah, those are all good things.
Yeah, we can help you to pull all those together as well.
Okay, great.
Yep, awesome. Great. Dave, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just quickly, Carrie, nice to have you on board. Thanks. We look forward to having your help. In-Young and I, we had a quick call yesterday to kind of restart everything. So Carrie will share with you the kind of working outline. It's more expanded than what you see here. And then maybe you can do a divide and conquer with that. So we'll do that after the meeting.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. And really, I mean, obviously the link to the website is just sort of the link. Some of it should hopefully just be kind of listing things just so that anyone who's flipping through the report and seeing this for the first time would be able to just kind of have what those things are. So the main content piece is just looking at some of the alternatives that were sort of looked at and kind of how we got to where we got to. Yeah.
Oh, and just quickly, we are going to try to do a sprint to about August 12th when school starts again. So hopefully just to finish up as much as we can until August 12th, and then we'll see what has to happen after that.
Okay, awesome. That'd be great. Okay. Anybody else? Phil, I see your hand up.
Yeah, let me just switch to the schedule you put up. I just need a second. Okay, so looking at the schedule, I'm down for items 1.2, 1.3, and I'm also down for item 4. That's item 4 is fine, but it may be more a better use of my time and skill set to do 3.2 engineering considerations from econ. Nobody's down for that now.
Yeah.
And have somebody else do 1.2 and 1.3.
Okay. So 1.2, any directions from City Council? I actually don't think we've had any, so that one's kind of done.
Well, we have to say that though. We have to make a good.
Me too. But feel free to take it and then cross it off your list.
Okay, so I'll still do 1.2, but.
And 1.1, you and Adina, you have a draft that I've seen, right? So that can just be tweaks. But yes, I agree. We do need. Thank you for pointing that out. But we don't, because I meant to highlight it and I don't have that. What I really see that being is simply a compilation of kind of the things that are on the matrix document that basically show like this will require a design exception. This will require this.
You're saying that you're talking about 3.2 now?
Yes, 3.2,
Yeah.
the criteria, right? But yeah, if you want to take a stab at that, that would be
Yeah,
fabulous.
I think that would be a good use of my skill set.
Yep, and Keith, that might be something, or would you be interested in that section as well?
Yeah, I can help with that.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So Keith, you and I should talk offline about that, how we would proceed and probably how and when and whatnot.
Yeah, and so staff, one of the things I need help with is figuring out what's the best way for me to be able to share with XCAP members eventually, not yet because we're not there yet, but being able to have an entire draft that people can see. Is it that we're going to be posting it every time we have a meeting? Like, are we allowed to work offline on our drafts without violating the Brown Act, or how does that work?
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry to say, I think I'm gonna have to check in with legal to figure that out. I do think that, offhand, the best way would be for us to share our draft at each meeting and pull the things together. But I don't know that, if for instance, all the chapters are separated into the groups, I think we're okay. But once it starts spreading throughout the whole XCAP, I think it needs to be a public document. So
Okay.
we'll have to touch base on that offline to make sure we're doing it correctly so that we're keeping everything available for the public.
Okay, and one specific question I have, if you could check in with Molly at legal, is that Google Docs does allow you to have a link that's visible to anyone who has the link but cannot edit. And in using that link, you can actually see version history. So as long as we don't, in the comments, go back and forth and start deliberating with one another, we could see sort of edits and suggested edits along the way.
Yeah, that's an idea. Possibly we could just make that a public, make that link available to the public at each meeting. They could see, and then whenever they wanted, they could check in on it and see what the process is. But I'm just not sure. So let me check in with them before we move down that path too far.
That'd be great. Yeah. And there may be a special window here because of COVID that may actually help us with this. So question about that. Okay. Phil, did you have anything else?
Just one clarification about 3.2. Are we talking about just the recommendations or all the different alternatives under study?
I think it's all the different alternatives, because the idea is we're going to talk to Sebastian Petty at Caltrain next. And so part of it is laying out for Caltrain all the places where we ran into some issues like design exemptions being needed is helpful when Caltrain is thinking about their entire process.
Right, okay,
what kinds of things are impediments.
Sure.
So,
all right. And that may also provide some clarification on the decisions we've made.
Yeah. And, there may be less on, for example, the South Palo Alto tunnels, which we sort of all agreed that is probably not something we're going to focus on, or we're definitely not going to focus on. But anything else that's been up for grabs, the more detail we can give as to kind of what was the issues or what are the constraints, the better.
All right.
And so in there, for example, I think we might want to include, I'm just thinking out loud, but we might want to include the emails that we got from the civil engineers who volunteered back in the fall and kind of gave us their perspective on water issues and storm issues and that sort of thing. So, okay. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to check in with the public and see, is there any member of the public who wanted to speak on this agenda item, which is the XCAP report outline? If you wanted to speak, you can raise your hand. Okay, looks like everybody is ready to jump into Caltrain, which I'm not surprised by. So, okay, with that, we can move to agenda item number 4. Which is a presentation by Sebastian Petty. And I should preface it by saying that we shouldn't have used the word presentation, but merely discussion with Sebastian Petty, because Sebastian's already warned me that he's looking for an open dialogue here. So Sebastian, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. And I'll let you just start wherever you're comfortable starting, and then we'll kind of hit you with probably a round robin kind of situation of questions.
Great. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. First, thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be back presenting to this group, albeit in a different circumstances and a different format. As Nadia mentioned, I don't have a presentation prepared today, but I understand that there are a number of questions from the group, so I'm happy to speak to those. before I get into that, I thought that it might be helpful, and particularly in light of a couple of the public comments, to just provide a little kind of 2-minute sort of just update on the state of Caltrain today, because it is a little different than it was a few months ago. And then maybe talk a little bit about how that relates to grade SEP work that we're thinking about on the corridor, and we can obviously get into more details about that in questions.
Could I ask one question, just because I'm going to be a pain? What is your role at Caltrain? Just so we can be clear what you do, what you're responsible for, what decisions you make, and that sort of thing before you start getting.
Sure.
And then you can. I'll stop interrupting. Thank you.
Yeah. Happy to answer that. So I'm the Deputy Chief of Planning. I report to Michelle Bouchard, who's the Chief Operating Officer for the railroad, who reports to Jim Hartnett. So that's the reporting chain. So I'm responsible for all of planning at Caltrain. That includes capital planning, operations planning, and long range and policy planning.
Thank you.
So that's kind of the domain that I'm overseeing. So Caltrain today, so as one of the public commenters mentioned, our ridership has been severely impacted by the pandemic. Most transit systems, certainly around the region and the country, have also been impacted. Caltrain has been particularly impacted in a way that is similar to commuter rail and other places. We today operate and have operated a service that is fundamentally a commuter rail service. It has a sort of a service pattern that's very oriented on getting people to and from work. And a lot of our ridership base has traditionally been more white collar workers. And these are folks who are by and large able to work from home, and that's what they're doing right now. So our ridership has been pretty low. In the first kind of initial month or two of the pandemic, we cut our service way down to about 42 trains, really just a local only service, and kind of we're in a scramble to make sure that we were putting safety protocols in place for our employees and our customers as best we could. Since then, we've increased service back up to about 70 trains per day. And essentially that's retaining hourly local service throughout the day and then layering in some limited stop service during the day. As we kind of look forward over the next many months, we're doing some service planning now to think about how we may adjust that service further. We're kind of looking at the early fall timeframe in terms of when an adjustment might happen, looking at how to sync that up with a planned service change on BART. And then it is likely that there will be further service changes that'll happen before we're really out of the pandemic. It's a significant challenge to Caltrain to lose the vast majority of our riders, in part because our business model as it exists, or as it existed pre-pandemic, was extremely reliant on passenger-generated revenues to support our operating budget. So about 70% of Caltrain's operating budget is generated from ticket sales or revenue sources that are closely linked to ticket sales, things like parking fees. That's almost entirely gone now, and so that puts us in a tremendously difficult financial position. Caltrain does not have an underlying dedicated source of funding we control. We don't have a dedicated tax measure of any kind that we can say bond against. And so we tend to live sort of check to check in the transit agency sense. And so we're in an extremely precarious financial position right now. We're currently really subsisting on federal recovery funding that was made available to transit agencies through the CARES Act. That funding is flowing into the region through MTC. So they have divided that into 2 tranches in terms of how they've given it out. In the first tranche, Caltrain did relatively well. We got about $50 million, and that's largely what's paying the bills right now. The second tranche likely will tilt more towards sales tax oriented transit agencies, so we don't expect that we'll proportionally get as large a share of that. One of the terms that has come along with the CARES Act is that we've been asked very strongly to not lay off or furlough anyone. And so we haven't. That's good. You know, it's what the purpose of a lot of that funding was, to keep people working. That does mean that that's one of the reasons we're running a fairly high level of service right now, is because our labor costs are relatively fixed. Fuel is cheap at the moment, and that really is our major variable cost. So we're subsisting in the mode that we're in right now, but we think that depending how that second tranche of funding ultimately lands, we're likely looking at late fall as being the point in time where we're going to be substantially out of money. And so we're in a lot of conversations and doing a lot of work right now to basically figure out what that looks like for the railroad, both in the sense of looking at various options for where funding could come from, both in sort of an immediate term sense as well as a longer term sense. And then obviously also looking at our cost structure closely and trying to understand what options are available to us as we cut service and potentially are in a point beyond federal funding where we are having to talk about layoffs and really severe cost reductions, what the options for the railroad are. We're a high fixed cost operation, so our costs don't exactly scale in a linear way as we cut trains. And so there's a real question about whether we're going to be able to cut ourselves to the point of sustainability here. So stay tuned on that. I know this is a little bit of a tangent to the grade separation conversation, but it just provides a little bit of context kind of around where Caltrain is right now and what we're sort of focused on, frankly, at the moment. In terms of just kind of pivoting from that to sort of what happens next and really kind of what Caltrain is thinking about grade separations, kind of as a reminder to the group, and I know this is a group of folks that is real educated about all things Caltrain at this point and how we work on those, but we are actively involved in one way or another with a number of grade separation projects along the corridor. We've got 25th Avenue in San Mateo that's fully in construction, and there are a number of other ones throughout the corridor that are in various stages of project development. Most of those projects generally come to Caltrain, even if they're being run through Caltrain, they're being funded typically from an outside source in San Mateo County. That's often sort of a portion of a county sales tax measure. In other cases, in Mountain View, for example, their city has been funding a lot of that work and now are in conversations about how to move to the next step and kind of when and how to leverage some VTA funding as part of that. So those projects will proceed. That's not necessarily funding or roles that are in jeopardy. Similarly, and I'll talk about this in more detail, the corridor wide grade separation study that Caltrain has envisioned is also one we are planning to proceed with. The funding for that effort was secured in a past year's capital budget. It's not funding that can really be repurposed for other things. And we've also been very publicly committed to that project. And it's really about not what happens next year or the year after. It's really about the long-term future of the corridor. And so that process is going to move forward. Although we're under a hiring freeze generally, I do have authority to move forward with hiring a position to run that process. And so kind of moving forward on that continues to be part of our plans. I'll pause there for a moment before maybe talking in more detail about what that work may involve, if folks have any sort of general questions about what's going on with Caltrain today, because it's a little bit of a unusual moment in our history.
So ex-cappers, if you have any questions, if you could raise your hand for me. Otherwise, we can let Sebastian kind of keep going. I see Keith. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, Sebastian, can you talk about how your Caltrain is funded? You mentioned a lot of it comes through the fare box, but the money that's not come through the fare box, it comes from the counties, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of to take it at a really high level, we've got two budgets that we pass every year, an operating budget and a capital budget. So I'll talk about the operating budget first. The operating budget is in past years has been about 70% funded through what I would call self-generated revenues. And right now for Caltrain, that's mainly fares. There is a small but not insignificant amount that comes through parking. And then there are some pretty small amounts that come through, say, like rental income and advertising income at our stations. The remainder of that the remainder of our operating budget comes from a couple different places. There's a handful of outside grant sources that we use. So there's state funding that Caltrain gets that can kind of be flexed between operating and capital. And so that will sometimes play a minority role in our operating budget. And then really the balance of the operating funding comes from the 3 counties that Caltrain runs through, who are also the members of the Peninsula Joint Powers Board. And that on the operating budget, that's based on a formula that relates to boardings. And so we have the most boardings in Santa Clara County. So the largest share of the remaining operating funding comes from VTA. The rest comes through Samtrans, San Mateo County, and the San Mateo County TA, and then San Francisco on the operating side through SFMTA's budget. Generally, those contributions are negotiated on sort of an annual basis, and it has historically been sort of the lowest straw kind of sets the level for everyone. So if one of the counties is having a challenge meeting their share, the other ones usually come down to meet it. And so it's kind of put Caltrain in a state of a little bit of perpetual financial anxiety on the operating side. So that's the operating budget. The capital budget's a little bit more complicated. Generally, you can think of the capital budget as sort of having, this isn't exactly how it's structured, but conceptually it's easier to think of it this way, as having really kind of 2 parts. One or the first part is what I would call minor improvements and state of good repair. So this is like cyclical capitalized maintenance, minor improvements that are going to be fully funded in a year that aren't going to have their own funding plan. So smaller scale stuff. That amount tends to be pretty steady year to year. It's around $40 to $50 million a year that's going into those kinds of sources. A lot of that money is coming from the federal government, and as well as some fixed contributions from the different counties. The other part of the capital budget is really big projects. And so if you were to go back and look at our capital budgets from year to year, you'd see the numbers vary hugely. A lot of that variance is basically if we're using a particular year's budget to issue a major contract, which could be something like a electrification, it could be a grade separation. Those projects are running through our budget, but they generally show up in our budget at a point when they have their own funding plan. So because it's of probably interest to this group, this 20 grade separation in 25th Avenue, for example, that is a Caltrain project at this point, but there's no real discretionary Caltrain money that's going into it. It runs through our budget, but there was an allocation from the San Mateo County TA, a contribution from the city of San Mateo, and in the case of that project from the California High-Speed Rail Authority. And so it's just sitting there in the budget. Hopefully that provides a bit of clarity.
Thanks, Sebastian. I see Phil next.
Okay, Sebastian, it's my impression that Samtrans doesn't directly manage the employees, so the train crews and similar operating employees, there's a third-party agency you contract with.
That's right.
Can you speak to how COVID has impacted that relationship?
At a high level, I can. I think it's generally to provide a little bit of general context. So the operations of Caltrain, which includes both the operations of the train, the engineers, the conductors, as well as the basic maintenance of the system, including the basic capitalized maintenance. So things like just right-of-way maintenance, vehicle maintenance, are contracted to Transit America Services Incorporated, which is a division of Herzog. So that's our kind of major operating contract. It's
no more Amtrak?
No more Amtrak. We switched away from Amtrak. I want to say it was a couple year process and a little before my time, but it's Herzog, Tazi now. Generally, we've had a good relationship with them. They've been, I think, important partners in kind of keeping the railroad going, and we're tremendously grateful to the work their employees have done in a real challenging time. Transit is an essential service, and those guys are on the front line, and so there's been a lot of work to really try to ensure their safety. I think generally the relationship has been fine. I think everyone is obviously concerned about the financial state of the railroad because their jobs are implicated as well. And I should point out that although they are managed through a third-party contract, virtually all of the employees who work for TASI are part of various trade unions.
Okay, thank you.
I see. Okay, I see Greg Braille, and then I'll get us back to the main thrust of the topic. So go for it.
Yeah, I don't have like a more technical way to ask this question, but is Caltrain going to make it? And what can we do? I mean, I am interested. I don't think everyone's going to leave Silicon Valley, and I think Silicon Valley is going to need, the whole region is going to need, the peninsula, good passenger rail transportation for decades to come. What are people doing, or what can we do to make sure that there's going to be a Caltrain in a few years?
Sure. No, I appreciate that question. It's something we're doing a lot of thinking about right now. And so one of the prior public commentators mentioned that the business plan is paused. It is paused. It's not going away. I would say that we have not avoided decisions the board has made, and we hope to finish it up soon. But one of the reasons we've paused it is because frankly, one of the reasons I paused it is because my bandwidth is pretty much tapped out doing recovery planning right now. And to your point, one of the things we're spending a lot of effort thinking about is really what are the potential range of futures that Caltrain may be facing. We don't know what's going to happen, and I'll talk about that in the context of grade separations probably a bit here. But in general, I think as we kind of do our scenario planning, one of the things we're thinking about that the major sort of axes of differentiation for us are the degree over time that some of the changes we're seeing to travel patterns are really fundamental and lasting versus maybe somewhat more incremental. That's going to be important. And the other major axes that will be hugely important to us is really the degree of kind of political cohesion and support that Caltrain receives and how that translates into monetary support. That can come from different places. We're real grateful for the federal bailout funding we're getting now. It's not enough for the region as a whole. And so that's a big question for us. And I think a lot of other folks is whether and when there may be further federal funding coming. We're in conversations with our partners, and there is still an active conversation about a potential sales tax measure. Our board is going to be talking about that tomorrow, actually, in terms of whether they intend to move forward with placing that on the ballot. That's a slightly longer term option in terms of when that funding would bring in, but it points to one potential option for Caltrain. So I would say in general, I wish I could say something more reassuring, but it's not a super reassuring situation right now. I think the railroad is in an extremely perilous position. And what I can say is we're looking at a lot of options, including some that are probably too creative for their own good. But, I think we're going to see a number of significant milestones this month. We'll kind of know for sure how much funding is coming in through the second act or the second tranche of the original bailout funding. We'll know whether our board and member agencies are interested in moving forward with a sales tax or not. That should be decided this month. Congress is going into recess in August, so we'll know before then if there's any chance that there's going to be another federal package kind of in the near term. And so based on that, we'll continue laying out options and kind of making decisions. One of the reasons we did pivot it, some of the recovery planning efforts into the business plan framework is in part because we have set up some pretty robust outreach channels for that effort. And so as we go along with our recovery planning and talking about what's happening to the railroad, we will be trying to have that conversation in public so that people can weigh in.
All right. I did want to acknowledge that In Young just was able to join us. So Sarah, you can note that for the record. Hi, In Young. And so Sebastian, I guess the real question is if you can get into the meat of whatever you can tell us right now about the grade corridor study and
sure.
Kind of what you imagine what's your plan?
Yeah, so I think that was an effort that just to kind of provide some background to anyone. So kind of immediately prior to my current role at Caltrain, a lot of what I've been sort of personally focused on was the Caltrain business plan, this big long range effort for the corridor. And one of the things that became very clear in doing that exercise is that there's a real grade separation question that does need to be substantively addressed. Excuse me. And so we did a lot of work within the context of the business plan to talk about different dimensions of the scale of the problem, including some kind of corridor-wide, just very rough costing, looking at efforts that are underway in cities, as well as crossings that where there is not an effort underway, but there's a reasonable expectation that someone at some point in the future might want to separate them. And we know that the scale of what we're looking at is likely in the double digits of billions of dollars. And I think part of that work led us to a place where we felt it was really important that grade separations kind of have their own corridor-wide effort to really think about this problem. That kind of is an unnamed mega project in the corridor. And it's always been addressed by the railroad on sort of a city by city basis, with usually us being kind of in a reactive mode. And so one of the commitments that we made as part of the business plan process that has been backed up in a capital budget is to do this effort. So, in terms of what that effort will entail and kind of what the time frame will look like, I think there's a couple of things I'd say. One is I'm going to be a little bit vague about the scope, although I'll throw out a variety of thoughts and ideas. But I think one of the reasons that I'm going to be a little bit vague about the scope is that we really need to go through a corridor and community process to develop the scope of that exercise. I know from kind of the Caltrain perspective what questions I would like to see answered in it, but we are going to need to go through sort of an initial phase of the study, which really is going to need to involve engagement with all of the different communities and interests that sort of intersect with the issue of grade separation to make sure that we've got a robust scope for that effort. And so that includes all of the local jurisdictions on the corridor. It includes regional and state partners, whether that's MTC, the Caltrans Division of Rail, high-speed rail. It includes certainly the counties who have historically had a big role in grade separation funding, and the different agencies that are involved in that. And so it's all of those folks are going to need to have some entree into this process and a role in scoping it out. And so the first stage of the study, which I anticipate, again, COVID's turning this into a little bit of a challenging setup, but I would anticipate that it gets going sometime in this fall, certainly by the end of the calendar year, would be kind of a learning and scoping effort with really the corridor and the communities to kind of cement a scope from a technical perspective of what needs to be covered in the effort, as well as talk about how a study like this is going to be governed. And what I mean by governed is, Caltrain has a decision-making role and we have a very specific perspective on grade separations, but clearly communities and community members do as well. And these are projects that have multiple beneficiaries. They have impacts to a whole bunch of different folks. So one of the real challenging issues that I'm going to have to put some thought to, and obviously would appreciate any input on, but we'll need to work this out, is really how do you run a study like that and do it in a way where communities feel like they're having meaningful input into the process and are able to buy into it, but where you have sort of this kind of asymmetrical relationship where you have a single railroad that's a service provider and also a corridor manager for 50 miles. And then 21 different local jurisdictions that corridor touches. So that's going to be an initial challenge of the study, is even really figuring out what is the right structure to have the conversation. The other piece that we'll need to figure out relatively early in the process is exactly what the contracting mechanism for the study will look like. And I'll provide a kind of a few thoughts on that. One is, as I mentioned, there is sort of budget authority to hire a position to run this study. And that is my hope, to hire someone. If I can't find the right person, I'll look at a way to potentially bring in a contract or individual who could do it. But the reason I really want to make sure that there is a single point of contract who can kind of have ownership of this is because I'm not sure that this is going to be one giant contract that goes out. I think this is a study, and I'll talk about it in a moment, that probably will get into a lot of different disciplines and a lot of different areas. And so it's one where work may be broken up between multiple contractors in phases, where we may want to reserve a certain amount of budget so that we have flexibility to adapt a little bit in the study as we go. What I can say, and in general, is right now Caltrain has a couple of active contracts that give us a tremendous amount of flexibility to procure people to do this work. We've got our ongoing sort of grade separation management contract with AECOM. That's one, but more recently our board just approved a whole raft of planning on-call contracts. We did a huge amount of outreach for those and have really 6 really robust teams, very well qualified primes, and really significant benches of subs under them during, including folks who have a lot of international expertise. During that process, we really emphasized that thinking about grade separations and grade separation policy was something that we were interested in. And so I'm confident that between all of those teams, we've got a lot of folks to pull from. If absolutely necessary, we certainly have the ability to RFP. We also have the ability to issue smaller source contracts if we're wanting an individual or someone who has a lot of expertise to come in. So that kind of covers what I envision as being really the sort of the first phase of the study, is really robustly scoping out how the process is going to run, what the technical scope of work is, and making sure that we have a contract strategy. In terms of the actual work, I think it's, sorry.
How long that section, that scoping part will be, more or less? So you're saying start in the fall and.
Yeah, my hope is to start in the fall, and my guess is it's probably about a 6-month process in terms of the kinds of community engagement we would need to see, kind of figuring out actual mechanics of how scope would run, developing individual work directives and things like that.
And that assumes that you have onboarded somebody by the fall. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So, fall, December, November probably is realistically what we're talking about. In terms of the second phase of the study, that's where, again, I'm going to leave this more in the realm of some thoughts and things that from a Caltrain perspective, we've either heard or think it's important to look at, but I don't want to leave people with the impression that that's necessarily closing the book on it. I think it's also, again, probably helpful to start that by just sort of reframing the conversation in terms of what are some of the big questions or issues that we see out there. And from a Caltrain perspective, I think what we see is that there has been an unprecedented amount of interest in grade separation from communities up and down the corridor in the last 5 years or so, really, since it kind of became clear that electrification was moving towards a reality, going into construction. Those are all in different stages. I think what we're seeing is that the costs for constructing these projects are going up, not down, and that's related to the cost escalation in the Bay Area as a whole. It's related to the railroad getting more complicated as we've got electrified infrastructure, PTC, positive train control, and more complex systems involved, forecasting higher levels of train traffic. Things are getting more complicated. And so there's, I would say, growing concern on the part of Caltrain that, we're seeing the interest level go up. We're seeing not a realistic level of funding to actually complete any of these projects. There are a couple of county sources. Santa Clara County is kind of the best position right now, and that there's sort of a fresh pot of Measure B money. But overall, there's clearly a huge need, and there really are not programs outside of local programs that really fund these things in a real way. There are not any meaningful federal programs right now. State funding for grade separations has been pretty, I don't want to diminish it in any way, but it is fairly minuscule relative to the size of the problem. You know, and we're also seeing that the construction methodology and standards we have are challenging. Palo Alto is not unique in having questions and concerns about those, and that there is clearly a need to think holistically about how these things are being sequenced, whether the standards and construction approaches that we're using currently are going to be the right ones for the long haul. So, you know, in terms of the kind of problem we're looking at, what sort of provoked our thinking about it, it's really kind of looking at what's seems to be happening city by city on the railroad and saying it's not clear that this is going to be a good way to get this done in the long run. You know, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, and it doesn't mean that individual cities can't progress that way as they develop funding, but at a corridor-wide scale, it's just not really adding up. So in terms of kind of the core areas that I think we would want to emphasize in a policy framework, I think I've said this to this group before, but I'll emphasize it again. What this effort will not do is try to design specific grade separations or crossings. It's not intended to do that. There are a lot of community, you know, that's an intensely sensitive community issue, as this process is evidence of. There are a lot of communities that have already gone on record and made decisions about what their community prefers. So we're not looking to overwrite that or interfere with this. But what we are, I think, wanting to get into in the process is first to look at construction standards and design standards, and to do that comprehensively on a corridor-wide basis, so that we're not asking individual projects to kind of go through onerous design exemption processes. I think there's clearly a corridor-wide interest in looking at that, so that's a huge component of this. I think related to that, there is some real work around construction sequencing and how construction contracting approaches and sequencing approaches can be used to keep costs under control and keep impacts under control. That's not really a conversation we've broached, in part because of how these things are funded. But as we see costs going up, that's clearly needs to be something that we're talking about. Those are kind of some of the really core technical elements that I think we need to get into. I think there's clearly a conversation about funding sources, and that's really why it's important that the corridor as a whole be involved, and that you have representation from the region and the state involved in this effort as well, to have that conversation about funding and to think about, you know, at some level what it is that we as a corridor might want to advocate for at higher levels of government, or whether there are novel funding approaches that make sense to explore at a corridor-wide basis rather than just a city or railroad acting independently. I think there's a major component around organizational analysis and governance around the delivery of these projects, around kind of what it means to manage a corridor as distinct from operating a railroad. What is the structure for administering funding? What is the structure for making decisions around issues related to grade separations that kind of span the difference between something that's clearly a city decision and clearly a rail decision, but there's a lot of them that are somewhere in the middle. So there's a major component that's needed on that. And then finally, I think there's a lot of work that's needed, what I would say more on, this is kind of a collection of thoughts, but things that are needed more on the community side. And that covers a lot of ground. I think some of it relates to what can these projects be beyond just grade separation? So what's the relationship of them to connectivity to other modes of access in cities and other changes to the transportation network? And are these projects that should be thought about in conjunction with some of those things? I think there's a related effort about what does it mean to create sort of new places as part of this. You know, a grade separation can potentially be a really great community place, or it can be a pretty terrible one. And so thinking about grade separations as a type of public space and what that means. You know, and then lastly, I think there's another reason we've wanted to approach this from a community level is you know, we've got again 21 different local jurisdictions on the corridor. They are very, very different. They range from San Jose and San Francisco to Palo Alto and Mountain View to places like Brisbane, which is a very small community, does not actually have any at-grade crossing, so maybe not a great example. But there's sort of an equity component, and there's a kind of a capacity component to this as well, where you have just cities who have very different capacities to engage in this work. And I think there's some importance for the corridor to think about, you know, whether there needs to be sort of an organizational capacity resource that helps some communities wrestle with some of these problems. So I just kind of vomited a lot at you guys, but that kind of encompasses the spectrum of what I think Caltrain is thinking about in terms of this effort.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. I'm going to let ex-cappers, if you've got questions, and as I wait for you guys to raise your hands, I will say, so Sebastian, where we are in our process is that we're hoping to make recommendations to City Council for the preferred alternative, which the city then has to go and do some further design work on. And kind of where we're stuck, as you know from the emails that we got from you guys, is that there's a couple of the new alternatives where having a different construction methodology could really help. And so the response back that we got was, well, use the most conservative one possible. But that, of course, sort of, there's a concern that that might make it look more expensive. It may end up being cheaper. Hard to know, right? And of course, there's some encroachment issues on some of them. I think the second thing I'd want to understand is at some point, one of the Caltrain letters that we got back discusses the rail corridor use policy, which talks about the potential of having 4 tracks somewhere between San Francisco Creek and Mountain View. And quite frankly, we hear you that 4 tracks are necessary, but the response we got back is that we might need them at a place like Churchill, where none of our designs actually even contemplate the possibility for 4 tracks. They don't in the south either, but we know physically they would fit. In the north, there's a question of whether that would fit. And so anything you could say about that aspect would be helpful.
Sure. So, okay, there's a lot. Let me kind of reverse my way out of that question.
I vomited back at you, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So on the 4-track subject, so within the context of the business plan and sort of the long range service vision our board adopted, and I won't spend too much time on the details of this because I know I talked about this previously, but the direction to Caltrain from our board was to sort of consider the very long range feature of the corridor, including the potential to run a lot more trains and the idea that at some point we would need some 4-track sections. In Palo Alto, those are associated with high-speed rail's proposed use of the corridor. What the analysis we had done essentially established a sort of broad chunk of the corridor where 4 tracks could be needed in the future. And so again, what was established was a range from, you know, milepost X to milepost Y, and the notion that somewhere within that range, there would be a smaller section that would actually need to be 4 tracks. So we've left it open-ended, and we've, for now, because railroads are conservative entities, we've encoded that into our rail corridor use policy that basically says, be real careful about permanently encumbering any land you own in this area, Caltrain, because you might need it for a project in the future. We know that within the segment that is flagged from Palo Alto to Mountain View, that there are parts of that corridor where it does not make sense to put 4 tracks, where it would be tremendously impactful to do so. And so there's work we need to do with both of the communities that are affected to really narrow that range down and think about where that infrastructure could realistically fit, up into looking at ways to shrink it, and what kinds of operational trade-offs would be acceptable to do that. So that's work to do. So I guess one of the things I want to emphasize is we're not trying to tell the community at this point that it needs to go in a place where you guys have already established it. It doesn't look like it's going to work. But from a kind of a what are we going to do with our land policy perspective, we're still in a very conservative place where we've got sort of policies on the book that say, you kind of need to demonstrate proof positive that it's okay to do something different with this land. And until then, Caltrain, you should be very careful about permanently encumbering it. So that from our perspective, as we talk about, sort of reversing back out of this, as we start to talk about what the next steps in Palo Alto's process might be, it may very well come out that becomes a very important thing for us to sort of reach a determination on of what areas it might be acceptable to continue thinking about 4 tracks versus areas where it's clearly not going to work and we need to narrow the range of focus down.
Okay.
I'm pausing because I saw that Councilmember Klein had a...
Well, good afternoon, Sebastian. Thank you for your presentation so far. Excuse me. I'd like to talk a couple questions with regard to time. The study that you say is going to start, say, towards the end of the year and continue into 21. And then you talked about going into a second phase. When do you see that being concluded?
In terms of the overall conclusion of the study, I think we're talking about something that's probably a multi-year effort. So my guess is that we're minimally looking at a 2-year time frame total, and based on where the conversation and work goes, it could be more than 2 years, but my guess would be about 2 to 2.5 years total.
So we're into 23 probably.
Probably, yes.
Okay. My other timing question is with regard to the various projects, any number of grade separations that may occur throughout the 21st century. So let's assume for the moment that you've got the one on 25th Avenue, for example, going on right now. And so let's assume that Palo Alto comes up with some preferred alternatives that it would like to see done. And its rationale would be more than just Caltrain. Connectivity, safety, so forth. And through some mechanism that I don't presently foresee, but some fairy godmother drops some money on us being Palo Alto, Caltrain, whatever, and says that, okay, we can move forward on these in 2024, 2025, who knows when. Do you see any impediment to doing that, or do you see all of these grade separations up and down the peninsula being done pretty much at the same time?
I think if there was let's say there was a giant amount of money that dropped out of the sky and suddenly these were all funded, I think we'd have a significant challenge in terms of constructing them. And that's one scenario we could consider in some of the work that I'm talking about. If we were to want to proceed simultaneously with doing all of this work, we would really need to look at a different approach to construction and probably some very severe impacts to service during the period of construction. I mean, grade separations are pretty intensive in terms of what's involved from the railroad perspective. So I think the short answer is, I don't know if there is a short answer to this one. I don't know that there would be, if the money appeared, I think we would figure out a way to make it work. But certainly if there's a desire to have a lot of construction going on concurrently on the corridor, that is not going to work in terms of the way that we currently do construction and operate service. And so if we wanted to be prepared for that scenario, we would need to do a good amount of planning work ahead of time to really think about what would it mean if we were trying to deliver $5, $7, $10 billion worth of grade separations in a relatively short span of time. It would probably look very different than the way they are constructed currently.
So without trying to pin you down, if Palo Alto somehow came up with all or most of the money necessary for building 1, 2, 3 grade separations and had a plan designed for that, and that put us ahead of all the other jurisdictions that wanted to build them. Is it fair to say that Caltech probably would be receptive to that?
Yeah, I think it would be, and really that's I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, that's how it works now, right? It's whatever one of these projects kind of gets its funding together and gets close enough that we say, okay, you know, we know that the railroad can sort of support a certain amount of construction at a time. You know, City X, you've got 200 million out of your 250 you need together. It looks like you're about to get real, and so we'll plan that in these years, you know, there's going to be intensive construction going on this corridor. That's generally how it's been working, and absent kind of a concerted program to do it a different way, how it will continue to work. So in terms of if it was just Palo Alto that suddenly had all of its money, I think we would do what we would do in any case, which is really look closely at the designs and the construction methodology, understand how that would affect our operations, and then look at how we could fit you in. And really the timing of that would depend on the funding that Palo Alto had, and it would depend on what other construction projects we had already committed to. That's really the answer. And we can't really lock that in until we're at a place where we've got designs and got some degree of certainty around, you know, that a majority of the funding is looking real, and we can sort of assign dates to it.
Thank you.
I see Greg and then Phil.
Hey there. So I think Larry's trying to understand, part of what I'd hope Larry's trying to understand is, you know, should we call this whole thing off and wait for you to be done with your multi-year study? I guess one question I would have is, I mean, as a Palo Alton, it seems like kind of, you know, selfishly, if we had the money, we would be asking questions like, how do we find out what designs are really acceptable and really not acceptable to Caltrain? And maybe this process would help with that. But one thing I'm wondering is, would this process create any economies of scale? Is there any way that the whole peninsula working together on grade separation could find ways to execute each project more efficiently, or maybe find ways to look for funding in a more coordinated way? Because that seems to be, it would be wonderful to find in any ways. Tony is not on the call today, I don't think, but he's always asking questions about why does it cost so much money to do these projects in the government sector? Are there any ways that by working together we can reduce the cost? And are there any ways that by working together we might have a better chance of finding the funding that we need for, you know, I mean, if we take the most expensive options, it's a couple $2 billion of work just in Palo Alto, for instance.
Right. I think the answer is that we hope yes. And so I guess let me try to answer the first part of your question, and I can come back to it. But just to say, I think there may be approaches where Palo Alto can do both. I'm not sure that you have to stop what you're doing and completely switch lanes and only focus on the corridor-wide effort that Caltrain is leading. I think there's probably a way to do both in parallel, and we can talk more about that. But in terms of the economies of scale, yes, and I think that's really why we're intending to do this work, is because I think what we're seeing right now is a corridor, and I don't think where it's being done intentionally, but this is how it's working out, in part because of the governance and the underlying funding. We're kind of doing these things in the slowest, most expensive way possible. And so I think the areas where we would look for some economies of scale are really around design and construction outcomes is really, I think, at Caltrain, we know that we do need to, there are valid questions being asked about construction standards and construction methods. We would like to really dig into those comprehensively and do it at a corridor-wide basis. So it's not a situation where Palo Alto or a different city is asking, hey, can we get a design exemption on this particular thing? And we do sort of a bespoke analysis about it. We'd like to look at it comprehensively. So that's the first area. I think that hopefully translates to some outcomes that yield construction savings or yield the potential for designs that are maybe more desirable from a community perspective. I think the other economies of scale is looking at construction. There's questions that I think are important to ask and answer. And I'm going to say this carefully because there is not a directionality behind this, but you know, if we're grade separating one crossing, is it important to do the one next to it at the same time versus leaving that for 20 years down the road? You know, what is the calculus behind that? How does that translate into thinking about how you would actually deliver work from a contracting perspective? In talking with, and I know that this group has done a lot of this research, but in talking with other folks in parts of the country and around the world who've done this, for example, in Melbourne, where they're doing a ton of grade separations, one of the things they talked about is one of the highest factor in their prioritization of when they're doing these things is how they can group them together for contracting purposes, because it creates such a scale. And then the last point that you raised is really about funding. And I would say, yes, I think it's much, you know, when we've seen, again, cities that have done grade separations in the last few decades have been very reliant on county funding. And what we have seen at Caltrain is really a lack of success in going after federal funding for individual ones. We've participated in many unsuccessful Tiger grants, and that's because at an individual level, these projects are not really competitive for those sources. There aren't kind of big sources out there. And so I think there's a lot of power in working together as a corridor in terms of advocating for new sources of funding to be created, or advocating in a way where we're able to articulate benefits of projects more comprehensively. You know, an example would be that it's pretty hard to ascribe hard rail benefits to individual grade crossings. We can talk about reliability and things like that, but they don't necessarily add up in a big quantitative way. But when you talk about, say, grade separations and scale being essential to provide a transformative level of service on the corridor, suddenly you're talking about a project or a suite of projects that has a whole lot of different benefits that you can speak to, where you can talk. And so I think you get where I'm going with it.
Yeah, I mean, just anecdotally, I mean, I've observed that Caltrain seems to have an awful lot of accidents, and it's got to be infecting the level of service you can deliver to your customers, and probably discourages some people from taking the train. So I would hope that there would be a corridor-wide benefit.
It does, and I want to say this very carefully so that it doesn't sound cavalier. When you put some of those on an individual crossing level, when you put those kinds of delays into a cost benefit analysis, which are one of the things you have to fill out if you're applying for federal funding, it doesn't come out as being something that makes the project clearly pop out as an obvious choice for funding. And so and I'm again saying that and not, you know.
But if we looked corridor wide at the number of incidents along the Caltrain that might be reduced if there were no grade separations at all, perhaps you'd have an easier time justifying something.
It's that, but it's also then I guess I'm struggling to explain this. It's when you talk about it corridor wide, you can talk about it in terms of other benefits, like the actual benefit of, you know, what you can do with a grade separated corridor in terms of moving people, things that you can bring in all the safety benefits, but you can also bring in the kinds of things like time saving, you know, saying that, you know, at that point you could operate more service, and there's benefits to that start to really scale in a way that changes the calculus.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Phil, next.
Sorry, I had to unmute. So I've actually got 4 questions, Sebastian. Do you want me to give you all 4 and then let you respond, or do you want one at a time?
Let's go one at a time.
All right. So the first one regards sequencing. So can you explain what that means either in a Palo Alto only context or in a corridor context?
Just at a really high level, I think it's, what I would explain is just, how are you contracting for these things, and are you doing them as individual projects, or are you building the shoe fly to do multiple ones, issuing a contract to do multiple ones, changing the service pattern to accommodate the construction of multiple ones, versus doing them one at a time, doing one at one city, jumping over, doing one in the next city. And so there's, I would say today there is certainly some thinking about that. And in a Palo Alto context, you have the opportunity to clearly think about all the ones within Palo Alto. But there are a lot of places in the corridor where you may have 2 very close grade separations that straddle a city line, for example. I'm thinking of the part of our corridor kind of between San Mateo and Burlingame, where we have a ton of at-grade crossings. So there's, I think, benefits to thinking about kind of the sequencing of these from just a pure construction standpoint, from how it affects railroad operations, as well as kind of how you actually package contracts and deliver these things. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's generally what
Yeah. So my next question is high-speed rail. Does high-speed rail, if whenever, does that make the assumption of a completely grade separated corridor, or will high-speed rail accept a transitional period with some crossing still in place?
Yeah, so it does not make the assumption of a completely grade separated corridor. So on the Caltrain owned corridor, their assumption is that they would be operating at 110 miles per hour blended with Caltrain service. The criteria for when a grade separation is required on a speed basis is 125 miles per hour. And so they have not made grade separations part of their plans. They're looking at measures like quad gates and other kinds of safety improvements, but not grade separations.
Okay, good. So the third question is regarding standards. You mentioned how the railroad industry is very conservative, and I appreciate that. But as far as I can tell by looking at Caltrain standards in the documentation, they all point back to larger, more comprehensive industry standards or government standards like ARIMA or AAR or similar bodies. Do you think that Caltrain is going to be comfortable changing or modifying from or departing from those standards?
So, and it's a good question. I want to set expectations. I think there are many, many standards that we probably won't be comfortable changing and wouldn't ever be comfortable changing. But I think there are some ones that have consistently been asked of us, things like what grade is acceptable, that don't really relate to an ARIMA standard necessarily. They relate to really the relationship with freight on the corridor, and how we look at that. And so I guess in some ways, this sort of swings back to that economy of scale question, which is, when we look at these things one by one, it's really a conversation about an exception and what, do we think UP will tolerate within a particular context. I think talking about it at a corridor-wide level, there may be an opportunity to have that conversation in a little bit of more of a fulsome way of what would make the most sense for the corridor as a whole, and is there a way to make UP whole and comfortable with that, but not have to adjudicate it on a project-by-project basis.
This is kind of an extra question, but I know that UP was looking to sub out their operations to a short line operator. Is there any new status on that?
No, there's no major update other than it's just my prolonged sigh. There's a lot of churn right now, and I mean, everything that's happening with COVID and the economy is just increasing the churn. So it's kind of a just continue watching the space, I would say.
Okay. So last question is, do you plan to engage with the local House of Representatives at the federal level as part of this governance issue?
Sure. I wouldn't just link it necessarily to just the governance issue, but really to the issue of grade crossings as a whole. We engage with our federal delegation regularly, and have actually advocated at times for increased funding of grade separations within the vehicles that's available to. And so I think, particularly as this gets going, it's absolutely something we would want to make sure our federal delegation was aware of. And, because I think would hope that a potential source of funding for grade separation in the corridor might be the federal government at some point in the future.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I just want to thank you very much. Those have been very helpful answers. I'm done, Nadia.
I was taking notes on what you were saying. Do we have any other ex-cappers who wanted to ask Sebastian a question before I've got one, and then I was going to open it up to the public. Keith, I see your hand up.
Yeah. Can you talk about your comfort level with shoe fly tracks? And if I were running a railroad and you told me that you're going to build some temporary tracks and electrify them and run my trains full of people over them, I'd have big concerns about both the safety aspect and the schedule impacts. Do you have those concerns, or are you at a level where you're more comfortable?
To be honest, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but what I would say is that is the methodology that, again, if you ask me today to go build a grade separation tomorrow, we would say that that we would need exactly what you just described, a shoe fly track, and we'd electrify it and run trains over it. We're not electrified, but using them now in San Mateo, and that has been the methodology we've used to build them. And so I think there is a level of comfort with them, if they're built to the standards we require, and there's a tremendous amount of due diligence that Caltrain does through our engineering department and our capital delivery department to make sure that they are safe and acceptable. That said, to the point that Larry Klein asked previously, if there was a world where we were trying to build, a dozen of these things at once, that's a world where I think the way you construct them and what you're doing with the service looks very different. Sorry, I got a little bit of a non-answer there, but I think the answer might be on a one-off basis. If it's in part of the corridor, yes. If we're talking about a mega project to sort of simultaneously retrofit the entire corridor, it's a little bit of a different story.
Keith, anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Sebastian, I had a couple of questions. So what has Caltrain's role been in helping cities choose preferred alternatives? I feel like we've been going through this process, but we haven't had quite the relationship that I feel like you might have had with other cities, but I can't, it's like when you're in your own personal relationship, hard to judge other people's relationships. So I don't want to speculate. I want to hear it from you guys.
Sure. So I think there's kind of two different answers to parts of that. One is, I think in general over the last, and I can kind of really speak to the time I've been at Caltrain, which is getting longer and longer every day now, but it's a little over 7 years. We have sort of philosophically taken a little bit of a hands-off role in it, in the sense that we've sort of said, these are our standards. Whatever you choose has to meet those standards. It's got to be constructible and something that'll work for the railroad. But we viewed the selection of a preferred alternative as really being a community decision. And I want to explain what the context is for that. I think when, there was a time not too long ago when we were talking about sort of an initial version of high-speed rail where this was going to be a fully elevated, grade separated 4-track system. And there was a lot of concern up and down the peninsula about that. And I think for good reasons. but a huge amount of concern about community impacts and what it meant to have these kind of giant structures plop down into cities. And so as a result of that, there was a real, I think, retraction by Caltrain from saying, okay, we got the message, here's the standards, you guys tell us what you want, and as long as it works for the railroad, that's really your decision. And that's really kind of the mode we've been in for the last while. The other part of your question, kind of about what sort of relationship does Caltrain have with cities doing this, and this isn't a great answer, but it is a real answer, is unfortunately right now grade separations are a little bit of a pay-to-play kind of project. There is no dedicated Caltrain money for grade separations. There is no dedicated money to support grade separation engineering on a case-by-case basis. And so when we have other cities that have sort of done the work, when it's happened in San Mateo County through the TA, usually there's a chunk of, if in some cases cities have asked Caltrain to lead the work because they just don't feel they have the staff capacity to do it. In other cases, they've asked for sort of heightened participation by Caltrain, particularly as the project advances. Usually there's funding that comes along with that to support the railroad's participation. And I don't love that that's the case, but that is the reality of the Caltrain funding situation right now.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. So, because I'm imagining one of the byproducts of things that XCAP could talk about with council is that, it would take a commitment of funding to be able to then get us to whatever the next level is, which is, I think, pretty much what Caltrain said in their emails back to us about our questions.
Yeah, and again, I think kind of and this gets back to, I think, the question I didn't totally answer about, does it make sense for Palo Alto to go their own way or to fully jump into Caltrain's corridor-wide thing? And I'm not going to try to answer what it makes sense for Palo Alto to do, other than to say, I think, as designs advance, the need for the railroad to be more heavily involved as we're moving something towards construction heightens. And so at some point kind of down the road, we would want to get into a service agreement with, whether that was with Palo Alto directly or sort of a three-party agreement with VTA, Palo Alto, if VTA were to be contributing significant funding, and the railroad to essentially cover costs. Those costs are going to be higher if we're having to do work that's really looking at a lot of things that are sort of outside of the normal standards. And that's not to cast a judgment on whether those things are good or bad ideas to look at, but if it's something that's generating a lot of work that the railroad needs to do, right now the practice is that we pass those costs on. So that's, a challenge that I would frame that's forthcoming. As these projects advance, they do get more expensive because the level of design increases dramatically, the level of review that's required increases dramatically.
Okay. Because it sounds like Caltrain's saying, we're excited to discuss grade separations, but we're not quite ready to talk to you right now. And if you still want to move forward with an answer, then we're going to need money for us to be able to answer your questions. And so I think the question that we're struggling with is, are we shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to push to be able to look at alternatives now, where if Caltrain's able to participate or able to have this corridor-wide study, you might, the loosening of the, for example, the percent grade standards might happen automatically, or Caltrain comes to see that yes, the jacked box construction methodology that was used in New York is something that would definitely be able to be applied and might even be preferred in the corridor. And so that, and so it might be saving us some future money. Of course, we've got the other pressure on the other side, which is that there has been an effort to say, well, we've raised this Measure B money, and if we don't spend it, somebody else is going to take it away. And that has kind of added this, whether it's true or not, it's added this level of pressure that, hey, we've got to get going. We've just got to say what our preferred alternative is, and then we're just going to study it further. And of course, if you don't have all the answers on some alternative, it makes that alternative a lot harder to support, especially if you're telling us we got to pay extra money to even look at it. And so it's kind of got us in a hard spot. And I'd love to hear kind of, how do we split the baby? Is it saying here what the pros and cons are of each of them? And as you move into the next phase, here are the recommendations we'd have from Caltrain in terms of technical answers that we would need, that you might be able to front load those first or think about those in an earlier part of the process? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that could be what you just described, could be an approach. I'm reticent to commit to it right now, but that could be an approach. I think, in general, I'm sympathetic that it is a challenging position to be in. There might be an approach where, and again, I'm caveat everything I'm saying here, but I'm sort of speculating because I really don't want to suggest the city should or should not do a particular thing. But I think, one question would be there may be ways to sort of provisionally select a preferred alternative, with an awareness that there is work going on that could allow for a better option to emerge, or an option that's more preferable, but that would fit within the preferred alternative. I mean, one of the, I think that's particularly easier to do if it's easier to do in a way where if you're kind of thinking about and advancing some work on something that would be more impactful, and then you're able to get to a better answer that has fewer impacts and sits within the footprint of what you would have had to design. That's an easier way to go than the other way.
Kind of an end statement for alternatives.
Something like that, potentially, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, just to jump in because I think, I hate to say this, but these are kind of unfair questions to ask Sebastian. I appreciate his answer, but I think those are somewhat the decisions that, the city needs to make, the city council needs to make. And I do think Sebastian's correct, though. I think what we're going to want to see, hopefully, is an effort to take us to this next phase, led by the, whatever recommendations the XCAP makes, but with some kind of sense that this is just moving into the next phase of this project, and that the next portion of this project is going to need to be coordinated with Caltrain through their study. So I think, it's kind of what we've been talking about for a while here is XCAP's end product might say, under these circumstances, this is the scenario that is preferred. And potentially, if X happens, or if Caltrain's study determines that, certain things are feasible or recommended or whatever, then this would be potentially the preferred alternative, or potentially a priority ranking of different things. So that's kind of what, I would say staff's recommendation would be in this.
Thanks, Philip. I wanted to have Sebastian, it's a discussion that I think we've had more offline, but I think it's important for the public and everyone to sort of hear that even if we don't have the exact answer, inching towards the answer, even with some caveats or if then statements, is still really progress in this very complicated process. And I think it was important to have, to hear from both of you. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think the one thing I would add, which I do think and I appreciate you jumping in, Philip, that I can say is that I think and I said this before, what Caltrain is not looking at in this study is, what should happen geometrically at specific intersections. And so I do think clearly Palo Alto has advanced a lot of thinking about that, and that thinking is going to continue to be important because we're not going to do that piece of it. And so having some city process that is thinking about that and advancing choices about it, I do think is critical for Palo Alto.
I see, Keith, did you still have your hand up from before, or?
That was old.
Okay, go ahead. So Larry, I saw you.
Yeah, I'm assuming that particularly in the second phase of the study, that you talked about, Sebastian, that you would want to hear from various city representatives that say, for example, change the standards with regard to grade, or to talk about urge Caltrain to adopt one particular construction method rather than another, or things of that nature, that you would actually welcome cities' representatives advocating for various changes. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, you know, it's, again, this is important that I say this really clearly about particularly things like standards and construction methods. You know, we need to do the due diligence to understand what's possible and what the constraints are, and to articulate those transparently for everyone. You know, because I don't want to promise that the outcome is going to be something where we're, you know, radically cut the cost.
I'm just saying that I think when you're considering things like that, it helps to have somebody advocating a position.
Absolutely. And I think beyond that, I would say it's particularly helpful to have people advocate the why also. Because these are projects that I think the more we're able to understand them as not being just a rail project, that they are both a rail project and a community project, and they have kind of mutual implications. And I think for kind of all sides to really understand that all of those perspectives have value and importance, that helps, I think, all of us make better decisions.
Thank you.
Greg, I saw your hand up, and then I'm going to go to public comment.
Yeah, it sounds to me like where this is leading us is, again, what I was trying to get to, I think last week or the week before, about sort of the level of abstraction of our process here. It seems like it's a benefit to the city and to Caltrain if we may have some clear recommendation on, from what we know today, these alternatives are more preferable based on what we know than these other ones. But then it's not helpful necessarily for us to get into construction techniques or sequencing or anything like that. It seems like it's kind of a waste of time for us to get too deeply into that before Caltrain is able to do it in a more corridor-wide manner. I guess that's not really a question, but you know, it just reminds me that, you know, rather than saying, you know, let's give up and come back in 3 years, it really seems like we need to continue our work of coming up with the preferred alternative with the information we have today to inform the process going forward. That's all.
Thank you. I think I actually heard that a little bit differently. I heard it as a yes and. So in other words, if you know that there's alternatives that you can't necessarily get into, and there's technical reasons why, let us understand what those are, so that when Caltrain's looking at, like, okay, what are the things that cities are struggling with, they can understand, oh, it was the jacked box, or oh, it was the 3% grade, or whatever it's going to be, right? Because that lists for them the things that are impediments to people getting the kind of separation that they may have preferred. You can't move forward.
Right. Right. I mean, other than sort of the, you know, the all the money in the world theory of we just want the trains to be invisible and silent, it sounds like perhaps we would get into a situation where our recommendation is, we don't think this is possible, but this is what we want because of Caltrain's restrictions, so we'll take the second best. Yeah, maybe we'd get to that. But I think that not having a recommendation at all would not help the process going forward. That's okay. So thanks.
All right, I'm going to open it up to the public. I see one member of the public. If there's anybody else who wants to speak, please raise your hand now. I'm going to wait about a minute to see how many speakers we have so that I can figure out how much time we're going to have. Is there anybody else who wants to speak on this item? And just as a reminder, it's a comment. It's not going to be questions. So I'm not going to have Sebastian answer any specific questions. He's, you know, we as XCAP members are hearing you, but I don't want the expectation to be set that anything that you're asking is something that Sebastian is going to be required to answer during this visit, because I want Sebastian to still want to come back to a meeting if I have to invite him. So, okay, great. I see 2 people have their hands up, so you can each get 2 minutes. We can start with Barbara. Barbara, I think you can unmute yourself at this time.
Thank you, Nadia. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Sebastian, for your honesty and sobriety. You have certainly helped elevate this conversation to the 40,000 foot level. So the COVID virus has created a paradigm shift, meaning there's been a fundamental change in many aspects of life. We're in the midst of what's being called by thought leaders phase change. For example, the Industrial Revolution was a phase change, moving manpower to machine power. What applies this time is we're experiencing a dramatic spatial shift. Virtual space is being swapped for physical space. In our backyard, Silicon Valley is embracing work at home and more dramatically, work anywhere. Given this paradigm shift, clearly says this grade separation exercise along the corridor needs to be put on pause. It's a colossal waste of time, money, and destruction of a town to address an issue whose underlying assumptions are so obviously no longer valid. Again, I recommend grade separations be put on hold until there is clarity in this new world. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Our next speaker, it looks like it's
Adrian Branch. It's your turn. You have 2 minutes. Please unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly comment on the line of questioning that I think it was Commissioner Greg Braille was asking of Sebastian, and that is regarding the number of incidents that Caltrain is inflicted upon Caltrain. It's a politically sensitive subject, but easily over 90% of the incidents are suicides. And as we've seen repeatedly on BART recently, which is good about not publicizing these things too much, and Caltrain has made a concerted effort also to not publicize them so much anymore. Just I think it was a week and a half ago, we had, and I have personally, unfortunately, seen this in all my years. We see that people can and do commit suicide at stations. It just happened in Menlo Park week and a half ago. The gentleman deceased died at the hospital. But so the reason I bring this up is that we need to be clear-eyed about the number of incidents and what fraction are actually avoidable by grade separations. As long as Caltrain is a system like BART where people have free and easy access to the tracks at stations versus systems, more modern systems, busier systems around the world where they install what are known as platform screen doors, which just like elevators prevent people from accessing the tracks, just as elevator doors prevent people from accessing elevator shafts. Until we get to that point, I would venture to say somewhere around 90% of the incidents are not avoidable via grade separations. The ones that are truly accidents, of course, and those are people that accidentally turn their vehicles down the tracks at night following GPS or unfamiliar with the area, those kinds of things. So just want to bring some reality to that aspect. Thank you. Bye.
The caller with last 3 digits of 262. You have 2 minutes. Please unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Hi, this is Roland. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Sebastian, for the presentation. There's a lot going on with MTC right now, and I think this is what you should be looking at, and it's known as Plan Bay Area 2050. And they're looking at all these mega projects, that people are throwing up left, right, and center. And they basically decided to break up the entire thing between the first period, which is between now and 2035, and the second period, which is between 2035 and 2050. And so they got a bunch of projects that are advancing to period 1. And your grade separation would not make it. However, this is where this comes in, and this is why you probably want to watch the planning meeting on Fridays between NABAG and MTC. They'll be showing the same presentation. They're saying that if you have got a period 2 project, you can, right now, begin and advance through project development phases and see environmental approvals. And I believe that once you land on a solution everybody's happy about, that is precisely what you should do. But then they carry on, they say that projects in period 2 cannot advance directly into project implementation phases, which means you can't start building this. But then they're putting a caveat and say, however, you will be, once you got environmental clearance, you will be able to advance the project on, from period 2 to period 1 on 2 conditions. The first one is somehow magically all this money shows up. And then the other one is that you figure out a way to make it this project more equitable and cost effective. And I think you should be looking at this moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Eduardo Locke. Please unmute yourself and begin speaking.
Sebastian, thank you, Nadia. On the safety item, I have seen the train hit a car right in front of me on Churchill. And that the chances of me being on Churchill when that happened are very small. So there is a significant safety issue with having at-grade crossings. I want to encourage you both, Sebastian and Nadia, and ESCAP members to please continue your work. The pendulum has clearly swung right now because of COVID towards working at home. In the long term, we're going to swing back to having, yes, 10% more, 20% more people working at home. But there's a lot of work and a lot of entertainment, and a lot of things that are going to go back to normal once we have a vaccine and once we understand how to manage pandemics. So the work that we're doing right now is not work that's going to be helpful in a year or 2 years from now. It's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So please continue to do the work. And I think as a community, we need to understand that the pendulum is going to swing back, and we're all going to want to go to games, and we're all going to want to go to San Francisco, and we're all going to want to move around outside of our homes. And the train is a very, very effective way of doing that. And I just urge you guys to think long-term about this. And please, I want to thank you for your work. And I want to make sure you're not discouraged by the current situation. So please keep it up, and thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker has the last 3 digits of 262. You can begin speaking now. Speaker with last 3 digits 262. Phone call is, are you ready to speak?
Oh, that was the last one.
Yeah, I think they already actually.
It looks kind of scary.
Eduardo, if you could, yeah, perfect. I think
this is Roland. I already spoke. Thank you.
Yeah, the 262 was Roland, so I think we're done.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. It looks like we don't have any more public speakers. So I'll bring it back. Okay, any final questions from ex-cappers? Or Sebastian, is there anything that you wanted to say? I don't see any hands from my ex-cappers.
No, just thank you so much again for having me and taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry, I did want to, because this is something, I had a conversation with the Dean 11 about the Plan Bay Area information about the phase 1 and phase 2 projects. Is that a potential funding source that we should be keeping an eye on?
Not exactly. Sorry, this is a really complicated answer. So I think what's important to understand is that grade separations are generally included programmatically in the plan. And so where the phase 1 and phase 2 stuff is really critical is around kind of like transit mega projects. Generally, it's a convoluted process at the best of times, and then between COVID and questions about faster Bay Area kind of coming on and off the spectrum, it's gotten more complicated. But it's really a vehicle for how federal and state funding would potentially flow into the region, and how MTC is designating that. So it doesn't inherently sort of produce funding on its own. Caltrain, as part of our submittals to the project, had initially submitted a giant kind of quarter-wide wad of grade separations, and that got pretty quickly fiscally constrained out of the plan. But eligibility for grade separations as part of the plan is has in the past, and I think continues to be this time, kind of they're programmatically eligible. So it's, they generally haven't been major recipients of discretionary federal or state funding previously, but there's also never really been a question about their eligibility to proceed forward.
And so presumably if after the 2 years of this quarter-wide project, we have one giant mega project that now has a price tag for it, then that would be the type of thing that we could apply with.
It could be, and I mean, something like that might need to be amended into the plan, but if it was something that was kind of coming with its own funding source, which for something like that would need to be part of the conversation, I in the spectrum of things I think we should be worrying about, I don't necessarily see it as a major thing that's either going to enable or impede progress.
Okay, great. Gregory, looks like you have a last question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know I'm talking a lot tonight, but hey. So yes, if I look at my little spreadsheet I made of all the rail accidents at grade crossings in Palo Alto since 2003, if one possible exception, the ones that resulted in a fatality were unfortunately by the FRA ruled as suicide. However, that is much, much less than 90%. It's in fact less than 50% of all the grade crossing accidents in Palo Alto, some of which involved significant vehicle damage and could well have involved loss of life if we weren't very lucky, for instance, because there are people at Churchill who actually a couple of times in the last couple of years have literally pulled people out of cars as the train was coming. So I want to be a little careful about sort of ruling that grade crossing safety is less of a problem because many of them are suicides. I think it's a very sensitive topic, and I think we have some safety issues in Palo Alto to address, even if everybody was behaving normally. So thank you.
Okay. All right. Seeing no further hands up on this one, I wanted to thank you again, Sebastian, for coming. I know we've been working together now for 7 years since you got to Caltrain, and I know it's been a long journey. I did want to let the public know that Sebastian receives many emails from folks like CARD and others who are sending him things about the Melbourne projects and the Long Island Railroad projects. And I know from firsthand experience that he's open to getting extra information, so feel free to send him things, but know that he's already at least on those big ones. So we really appreciate you coming today. So thanks.
Thanks for having me. Have a good evening.
You too. Okay, so we're a little bit over time. Carrie did have to drop off because she is chairing the PTC meeting. The last thing that we have is XCAP member updates and working group updates. I'll speak a little bit on Carrie's behalf. Carrie pinged me today. She is doing a fancy spreadsheet sort of thing where she's been able to take some of the criteria and break it down instead of the criteria the way the council has given it to us. It's kind of breaking down word segment by word segment of kind of what the general gist of was of the criteria, and kind of creating this useful document that is actually modeled on a Swiss document that was done for Caltrain, which basically talks about constraints, wants, and needs. So it's not so much value-based, it's more like what's a must-have, what's a nice-to-have, and what's a kind of an in-between. And so I'm hoping that she will have a draft available to be able to send out in the packet so we can discuss it next week. So that means that the matrix will probably be back on the agenda for next week as a discussion. So come ready with your thoughts on that one and be ready to discuss that one. Is there any other member who had an update? I know we talked a little bit about the report and we can talk offline, but is there anyone who wanted to update us on anything else during this time? Cool. All right. Seeing none, wanted to check in with staff. Ripon or Philip, did you have anything for us?
Yeah, actually, I have an update for XCAP. It was a question that was raised towards the end at the last XCAP meeting on the July 1st. And it was regarding if we could mix and match underpass with hybrid options between Meadow and Charleston. So we were able to get some additional information from AECOM, and that I just wanted to clarify that regarding the Meadow and Charleston question. is that the roadway improvements can be accommodated for two alternatives at each grade separation location separately. So you could choose either one of those options at the two grade locations. However, it would require amendments to the railroad grade at both locations. So both Meadow and Charleston will require some kind of rail grade adjustment in their elevation. And the reason is that when the tracks are raised 14 feet, on one, the transition that it required to come back to the original grade is more than the distance between the two intersections at the grade that's acceptable to Caltrains. So that requires to have some adjustment at both intersections. So if we were to pursue based on currently what we know of what we is current methodology, the project will therefore require longer shoe fly and then anticipated just for one grade separation location only. So just wanted to clarify that, yes, we could do the mix and match for geometry of the grades, the roadway configurations, but it also impacts rail grades profile differently. And so it will require some adjustments at both of them.
Great. So Ripon, can I request that either you or AECom basically put that in a memo to XCAP? And the reason is more for the formality of making sure that that makes it into the report, because if this is something that isn't going to get picked up in 5 or 10 years, I can't be sure that someone's going to go back and watch this little piece of video. And so I'd rather be sure that we have some kind of official memo, which we can stick into the appendix. So I don't know if that would be you writing us a memo or if it's AECom responding to the city, whichever it needs to be, but I think that would be most helpful.
Yeah, certainly we can update you with a one-page memo that explains that. You could attach that to your appendix as well of your report.
Great, thank you. Because my video cut out a little bit, so I also missed a couple of keywords. I just want to make sure that we got it right and that the video, the record doesn't also miss it. So thank you, I appreciate that.
Sure. So we wanted to give you that information upfront right away as soon as possible.
And just confirming for the next meeting, we're going to have the updated noise and vibration report. Okay, great. All right.
All right, thank you. That was it from the staff.
Okay, great. Awesome. So just as a reminder, we do have, the next meeting is July 15th. We go back to our 3 p.m. time. And then the week after that is the 22nd. Those of you who needed to talk to me about your various sections, if I could ask you to just please ping me and we can set up a time to chat and we can go through any questions you have, that would be awesome. And Ripon, just wanted to remind you that we need to find out from legal about what is the sharing methodology that we might be able to use if Google Docs is going to work if we have a public link. That'd be super helpful to know sooner rather than later so we can sort of plan accordingly.
Yes, we'll follow up after consulting with our legal department.
Great. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks to our attendees for hanging in there. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all.